Hello and welcome to this week's Sunday Sit Down, in which I'm going to be talking about the first player in board games, how players decide who is going to be the first player, how much that matters, and whether or not it's better for that to be random or silly. We have a guest appearance from my cat Biddy here. This came up the other day. I was at Geekway Mini and I was playing Snowtails, which is a racing game, and I noticed that it had a really funny, to me at least, a really funny first player determination, which was the player with the huskiest voice, because it's a game about husky dogs pulling your dog sled. And I thought it was particularly clever because not only did it say the first player is the one with the huskiest voice, but it also said I think it had a line that said something like, for curmudgeony old gamers, you can determine first order, the first player randomly. And so I liked that it kind of built these two things that I'm going to be talking about in this video into one little passage that kind of solved the problem that I think I have with you going one way or the other. And so I'll come back around to that at the end of the video. I'm going to start with the solution here because I think that is the best way to do it personally. So first player in a lot of games, as you know, it's often just determined randomly, and sometimes it's determined by a silly rule. And the silly rule is what I mostly wanted to talk about today. I have kind of a top 10 list of games that I've played with silly first player rules that I really enjoy, that I think are really, really clever, that make me smile, and they're a little bit memorable too. And so I'll go into that in a second. But let's see. I have a bunch of different ways to approach this topic. I think a lot of these I found, or some of these these silly rules aren't designed all that well. And that's obviously a judgment on my part. But for example, there are some that say things like that point to someone's physical features that might result in players passing judgment on that player. For example, one well-known one, I won't say the game, but it's the player with the pointiest ears. So someone who might be a little sensitive about their ears might actually take offense to that, as clever as that is in terms of the theme of the game that I'm mentioning. The other one is, there's another one that's the player who looks the most suspicious. And that, I don't know, that seemed a little off to me as well. That it becomes a judgment call when you look around the table and determine, who looks suspicious right now. It can be fun among friends, but if you're not always playing games among friends. You might be playing with new friends or at a convention. So I with these silly rules, I like when they are, when they don't pass judgment on things that people can't control. I like when they are thematic, when they're tied to the game itself. For example, For Sale. The first player in For Sale is the player with the biggest house, which is related directly to the theme of the game. I like when it's fast. So if it causes a big debate among players, that can become a problem. I can see that going either way in Kodama Duo, which I actually enjoy the first player, which is whoever's wearing the most green. So it was kind of a neat moment when I played Kodama Duo because we had to actually look at each other's clothing and see who was wearing green at the time. That was kind of a neat little twist. At the same time, that could lead to a bunch of debate if you can't determine quickly who's wearing the most green. And I also like these silly first player determinators when it breaks the ice, when it's maybe a little funny, like the huskiest voice, and when some of them give you the opportunity to actually learn about the other players at the table outside of the context of games. For example, let's see, I'll look at one of the ones that's not on my top 10 list. So like in the Quacks of Quedlinburg, which I talked about the other day on my channel, it's the last person to cook. So it takes you out of the game for a moment and makes you think about your life just for a second, and you get to share that with other people at the table. And I think that's really neat when you get to share the last thing you cooked with other people. You get to learn something about them that's a little bit outside the context of the game. It might create a conversation during the game outside of the game itself. So those are kind of my overarching guidelines, I think, for creating a silly or fun first player determinator. And let me go through my 10. And I in the links below, I'll post some Board Game Geek lists that list a number of games that have these fun, silly designators. I only picked games that I've actually played, so that was a big restriction for this. Snowtails is certainly on the list. These are in no particular order. So the Snowtails, the huskiest voice, I thought was great. In Tzolk'in, one of my favorite games, I should have pulled it off the shelf. I have it on my shelf back there. It is the last player to sacrifice something. And this might walk some of those boundaries that I said before, but I think it's so cleverly thematic about Tzolk'in, which is a game where you actually can sacrifice things in the game. Not people, but you sacrifice... there's certain things you can sacrifice in the game. And so I like that idea. And it makes you think for a second, like, when was the last time I did sacrifice something? What does sacrifice mean in my life? Dinosaur Island. It's the last person to extract DNA from amber. There are a few that are like this, that are exceptionally rare. Like hardly anyone will ever have done these things. But I like it. For that reason, I like it, because it is so outlandish that it gets played. I don't know. It makes me smile when there's something like that. And one game that I didn't play that I saw on one of these lists that I wish I had played, because I love the way they worded this, is Moonbase Alpha. And the determining factor is the last player to walk on the moon, which is possible. People have walked on the moon. They could be in your gaming group. And the wording of it is the last player to walk on the moon, and in the rare case that there's a tiebreaker. So they're even poking fun at the silliness and the rarity of that determinator, saying, kind of playing off the idea that surely someone in your game group has walked on the moon. I really, really like that. There's outlandish ones. This one's really clever. Manhattan Project Energy Empire is the person who spent the least gas to get to where you are right now. That, I think, is really clever. It's perfectly thematic. It's pretty easy to determine, because you kind of guess, like, okay, who drove the farthest to get to where we are right now. I thought that was very, very clever. This is a good one. This is kind of a silly one, and a little getting to know you one. This is Steam Time. The person who is the least punctual. Now, this is one that you could debate for a little bit, but it's one that you kind of have to admit to the other people, that's me. I'm the one who's always running late. You could even, with Steam Time, you could probably even find it by the person who arrives at your table the slowest, because they're the least punctual. And it ties to the theme of the game of time travel. This one's kind of a nostalgia pick for me. The Speicherstadt was one of the first games I got when I got into board gaming. And the designator is the last person to visit Hamburg, which is so specific. It's a specific city. I'm sure for people in Germany, maybe that happens all the time, that you visit Hamburg, or that you have in your lifetime visited Hamburg. In my group, I think there was only one person who's been to Germany, maybe two at this point, but not even to Hamburg. So actually, and the running joke for a while was someone wanted to go to Hamburg just so they could be the first player from then on in Speicherstadt, which I thought was clever. In Blood Rage, it's the person who's born the furthest to the north. This is a great one for getting to know you. You think about, okay, where was I born? And you get to share that with other players and determine, okay, who is the furthest to the north? And it's perfectly thematic for the game of Blood Rage, this Viking-themed game. Deep Sea Adventure is the person who is the last person to swim in the sea, which I think is a great one, because you can definitely think, okay, when was the last time I did that? And you get to share with other players. And again, it's thematic with the game. Forbidden Desert is the thirstiest player. I think that's great, because you get to think of it right now. Like, who is the thirstiest? And yeah, you can debate it a little bit, but it fits really well with the theme, and you can think about it right now. Who's the thirstiest? And my last pick, I believe this is number 10, is a Super Motherload, which is the last person to dig a hole. I just thought that was really, really clever. Last person to dig a hole, because again, it makes you think about, like, have I dug a hole? Like, at some point, I'm sure I've dug a hole, but when was it? How long ago was it? You get to share what that hole was with the other players, and it fits in thematically with the game. So that perhaps the obvious downside with all these things, one of the biggest ones, is that it might end up being the same player every time if you play with the same people, like the Blood Rage one. The player born furthest to the north. If you always play Blood Rage with the same, say, like, game group of 7 people, the place where you're born is never going to change. That's always the same. So that's why I really like the Snowtail solution, that you have this fun first player thing for when you're playing with new people, when you're mixing it up a bit, but that you have the random option. The random option is always there. I really like that solution for it. the flip side of it with the random option is that it is a little less fun. Like, it always makes me smile when I start a game and I see one of these things in the rule book. In all my games, it is a random thing. I was thinking through my games. I don't think there's one that has the silly option. That might be, maybe I'm just forgetting it. In Between Two Cities, we do have, like, there's actually a component pack in the game. There's a big pack of cards that you shuffle up and you draw one, and they are first player determinators. I think there's maybe 12 or 14 in there, and we picked them very carefully so that they would fit all of these categories that I mentioned here. And we just included it in the game, which I thought was pretty cool. I don't know how many people actually use it. I think often it's easier just to sit down at the table and start playing. But in Between Two Cities, it's such a short game. So if you play back-to-back games, it can be a way to get players to mix up their player order, which can be pretty important in the game. And that's another thing I wanted to touch on. The importance of player order, whether or not it matters. Because many times it just doesn't matter. If you're taking, like in Scythe, you might argue that it does matter in Scythe, but Scythe is a game where you're taking a lot of turns. Every player usually takes around 18 to 22 turns in the game, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But the value of first player really isn't there. Like, you going 2 turns after me doesn't really have an impact on the game at all, especially when you're taking that many turns, and because of the types of interactions that happen at the beginning of a game of Scythe. So it really doesn't have that big of an impact. Whereas in some games it does have a bigger impact when you're doing certain interactions in a game very early on that have a specific, that make a difference in the game. I think the first player can matter, and in those instances, with the random solution. So I like the random solution with those, but some of those games. Try to balance it by saying, okay, like the first player gets 1 coin, the second player gets 2 coins, the third player gets 3 coins, and so on. With that, my preference is that the rulebook doesn't make you remember that kind of stuff. Like, I prefer when I get to a place with a game where I don't even have to look at the setup rules after maybe 2 games of it, where it's just so clear and intuitive, and the board just lays it out for you. Your player mats lay it out for you. And you don't have to look through the rules to determine that. You don't have to remember that through the rules. Because I found with games that have that, sometimes it's a little harder than you think to actually find that specific place that shows you what those players get. I wish there was better shown in rule books if they do have it, like a big box in a specific color that says this is what you got to think about when you have different player counts in the game for setup. But there are some games that have it clearly printed on the board. And one example of that came to mind was Pillars of the Earth. In Pillars of the Earth, you track your money on a track around the board, and it clearly shows you on the board the starting player positions and how much money you get, because there's a track there on the board. It's different for each player. I thought that was brilliant. So I think if you need to have players starting with different things in a game, I really prefer it to be printed on your player mat or on the board somewhere itself, so that you don't have to flip through the rulebook to find it every time you play. As for how to determine randomly, I think it's usually my preference is not a roll of the die, because roll of the die you can end up with a tie and you can get caught in this tiebreaker thing. My preference is to just shake up all the player tokens. If there's any sort of different player tokens between the players that are the same shape, to shake them up in your hand and randomly drop one on the table. That's my preference. I prefer that even over Schwazi. Many of you might be familiar with an app called Schwazi, where you all put your finger on a phone and different colors light up, and one player is left with their color and all the others are left blank, which I think is a brilliant app. But I don't like cell phones at game night. I want to put the cell phone away, and I don't want to wait for the app to load. Just grabbing the tokens is almost always the fastest way to determine first player, in my opinion. Yeah, I think I hit all the core points that I wanted to talk about today with first player. Yeah. So this is something I might consider in future games, if there's room in the rulebook to put a silly thing and then say, hey, if you're not feeling silly right now, here's the way to do it. Just randomize it. But having both of those options in there, because it kind of hits both needs. For people who want to smile, who like to smile at that sort of silly thing, and when they want to use it to get to know the other players at the table, I think it's great to have a silly option. But I think it's also good to have it printed in the rulebook that the random option is perfectly fine and is probably for the best if you are playing with the same people over and over again. So the Snowtails version, I think, is the solution for this. I'd love to see that in other games and in games that I publish in the future as well. I've skipped over a lot of games. Here's some of the games that I did mention. Hanabi is most colorful clothing. Troy is the last player to read a history book. Bruges, these are all games that I played but didn't quite make my top 10. Bruges is last player to eat Belgian chocolate. Kodama, I did Kodama. Ghost Stories, the last player to watch a kung fu movie. I thought that was really clever. Alchemist, the last player to most recently visit a laboratory. And Trickerion, the last player to wear a top hat, which I thought was great, but might skew a little bit or maybe heavily towards male gender as opposed to female players. Those are all my favorite first player designators, silly first player designators for games that I've played. And I'd love to hear yours. If there's one on this list that I didn't mention, I'll also post 4 geek lists below that if you want to click through and see some really, really clever, fun, silly first player determinators, check out these geek lists because they are full of really clever ways of doing it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Whether or not, if you have a favorite fun, silly thing, if you prefer one over the other, if you like the Snowtails solution, and if you like in games where you get a little bonus if you're not the first player, or if there's an advantage to last player if it goes the other way, and how games can help you remember that rather than making you dig through the rulebook. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this in the comments. Thank you for joining me for this week's Sunday Sit Down, and I'll be back on Tuesday with a favorite game mechanism video. I'll see you then. Bye.